I was born in Vancouver. No, I originally wanted to be a nun. I was raised in a Catholic school, so I think maybe that. And then to be a social worker, I think, yeah. Canada was huge to me, you know. I was in elementary school when we got the new flag, and so that seemed to me to be sort of like a branding. And I did feel a high level of attachment to the country of Canada growing up. Even though I was a Westerner, there was a strong feeling of that. I remember coming out to Ottawa, you know, when I was in high school, and it having, you know, just all the symbols were important. And also, I remember being very impressed, and actually through my entire career, with the Peace Tower. You know, I think it was around the service that it represented, and also that it represented peace. And it's still something I think we should be valuing as Canadians. So that was an important symbol. I went to the University of Victoria, and I studied sociology, and with a minor in political science. So I did kind of that humanities side. It was a great time to be at university. And I went from there to do some international. I went on Canadian Cross. I did a couple of international tours, and then I came back. I went to Carleton University, and I did it's very unusual, I think, for a deputy minister. I did my Master of Social Work in Policy Administration. So I went into more of a social stream. But a lot of the professors at that time in that graduate school were from, my major piece of work and my thesis was on Canada Health Act. And there was people that had come who had been ADMs and had like deep sort of experience in the government, in the federal government, and particularly in social policy. So I seem to be very fortuitous in that respect. But I started after university because that was a program where you did professional placement. I did my placement with the City of Ottawa, and which at the time, I was kind of drawn to local issues, and I worked on issues around housing and homelessness in the planning department and at the City of Ottawa Nonprofit Housing Corporation. I stayed working there. I ended up getting a job out of there and worked for the City of Ottawa. So I worked for municipal government. Then I went from there to the province of British Columbia. I spent about a decade with BC, and I was the deputy minister there. Then I went from BC to the federal government. Came in as an ADM and then became fairly quickly an associate. You know, I knew through the federal provincial tables that I was part of. I got to know certain deputy ministers. Alan Nymark was one of them, the late, great Alan Nymark. So I was able to use my connections. Wayne Waters was another person I had met around DFO issues. He was, I think, deputy DFO at the time. So I was able to use some of those connections. At the time, there was a fairly outward-looking recruitment for ADMs. I know a lot of people said, oh, you shouldn't go in as an ADM, but I did, and basically on Alan's advice, come in as his ADM in Environment Canada. And then, as I said, it was fairly short. And he convinced me, and I think it actually was very good advice, that you come in as an ADM, you really get to understand more the sort of machinery, I guess, and how government works here, how the centre works, how Treasury Board works. It's very hard to kind of land starting. I can't imagine coming in as a deputy minister, actually. Well, when I first came in, I was sort of in awe of the complexity, particularly the role of the central agencies. So, and I was at Environment Canada. It was, as it always is, had a big agenda. And I was doing corporate services. So one of the things that my best teachers were my director generals. They were, happy to teach me everything that they knew about the federal government, and I was happy to spend time with them and learn. So that was a really great entry point, and I had a fantastic team there. very motivated team, like high performing team. So that was fantastic. And the other thing that I received some excellent advice when I came in, and that was, don't draw attention to the fact that you're new here. You might have been working in a region. Don't think that everybody knows each other, but don't say, oh, I used to work for the province of BC. Just don't say it. And it was also part of the culture, right? That even if you were lifting lessons, and I did at times, from my provincial experience, never make the comparison. It also, I think, spoke to the sense that you don't want to give any sense that you're an outsider, you want to be an insider. And and it was excellent advice. I followed it to a T. You know, in my case, the deputy ministers changed. Alan left, and we had a new deputy minister, Suzanne Ertebise, and I became a key advisor to her. And because there was a lot of issues that I had sort of line of sight to from where I was in the corporate side, so I think that really was, I was fortunate to have the deputy's ear and to be able to kind of represent the department on some bigger files. And that's how I got to know then the clerk at the time. And then I was actually quite surprised because it came fairly soon that I was called to become the associate. I went to Natural Resources Canada. I had a good run at Environment Canada. So I was familiar with a lot of the sort of policy work that was on the agenda in that area. But stepping into the role, it was like a big jump. I had some background, of course, as a deputy minister, so I understood the role. I sort of inherited, I would say, a fairly fractured department, quite frankly. I mean, it was a highly competitive team around the table. And if I could be so frank, all men. And I had to kind of assert authority fairly early on. I think maybe within the first 2 weeks, I put an ADM on leave with pay. I sent him home for insubordination at the executive table. You know, I was placed at NRCan with the express sort of mission of creating more cooperation between the two departments. So and at the same time, I was probably seen as coming in from enemy camp, from Environment Canada. And that made it more challenging to sort of take control of the executive table, which I think you really have to do as a deputy. Right? And so it meant a whole kind of change of the way that we were operating at NRCan, because our job, as I thought there were people in leadership positions who felt our job was to defend the oil and gas sector. Like a little bit of stakeholder capture, I would say. There was also lots of brilliant people there, right? I did something at NRCan to sort of change the conversation of creating a North Star table, to sort of re-envision who we were as a department. It was a heavily siloed department with some great old institutions in their own right, like the Geological Survey of Canada and the Forest Service. They saw themselves as almost, kind of like franchises of the department, and they didn't. So I shook things up, I think, a lot at NRCan. And that was the only way I could change the kind of conversation in the culture, and also draw out the expertise that was in the department and the really innovative thinkers in the department, right? And I think it actually started I'm modest in terms of the impact it had, but it did actually create a new way of thinking and talking about natural resources. As opposed to seeing it in opposition to Environment Canada, seeing that the only way forward was to collaborate and to bring our expertise to the table around climate change. one thing I think that's important is to ensure that your team knows who you are and how you lead. And so I think that even on the very first day, and this is what I would do in the first time I would convene a table, is to not only introduce myself a bit, biographical information, but also to say, this is how I like to lead organizations. Right? I learned that along the way, that it's better to come out early and say, for instance, I want you to collaborate. It's a fairly simple thing, but I won't tolerate you competing with each other or withholding information. So, I had a list of things that I really believed in and that gave them sort of a no surprise environment around, this is how we're going to work together, this is how I want to lead, and this is how I expect you to lead. And then with a really strong emphasis on values. So in a certain way, I think that sort of I try to set a tone, right? And in setting that tone, to make it clear that I'm assuming a new leadership of this team, and this is how I want to do it. Yeah. I'd probably bring a core approach to every job that I've sort of honed or developed. I haven't ever met a team that couldn't be improved, or that couldn't improve it in terms of its functioning. And I believe that there are some kind of chronic issues within all public service, that. And part of it is, for instance, in silos, and I was really very strong, I still am, on collaboration, and I think it's sort of an essential way of moving forward in terms of a modern public service. So yeah, I have taken over teams that I thought had been allowed, I think, to develop in a way that were sort of, there's some unhealthy tendencies, let's just put it that way. I actually believe that it's a little bit of both, right? You really have to learn where you're working. So it's a funny thing, I started working in housing well before it became such an enormous national issue. But I started working in housing with the City of Ottawa. I went to British Columbia and was the ADM in municipal affairs. I'm responsible for housing, then became the Deputy Minister of Housing and amongst other responsibilities. So when I was first moved into a generalist role, into environment, I was stunned, right? That, whoa, I don't work on the dirt side of government. I had no background in that. It was interesting because at the time, the issues were really fraught from a stakeholder perspective. So one of the reasons that I was moved was because I was seen as somebody who could work with stakeholders and to sit around a table and try to work, and particularly with First Nations at the time. So I could see that actually allowed me to see that I had skills that were highly transferable. And then I did, for the rest of my career, really work more on the environment, natural resources side of government. And so I do feel like, that's why I say the combination, I've seen some brilliant people, leaders who were deep subject matter experts, right? And they're brilliant if they were able to sort of, elevate their thinking beyond that subject matter expertise to see the strategic, to have a vision. So I think it's kind of a combination. I would just say that in the time I was in government, I was always trying to promote individuals with a science background because there were so few of them at the upper echelons of the public service. And I thought we needed that around the table. That is where my old political science training really served me well, was understanding, the role of ministers and the ministerial accountability as part of the democratic system, which oftentimes gets missed. I learned a lot about working with ministers in the provincial government, and it was a little more rough and tumble then, and with less kind of padding around the ministers, they were much more accessible. And one of the things I think is really important is establishing the relationship. You know, that it's not to manage them, but to get to know them, and particularly to get to know what they are trying to achieve. I was just giving advice to a new minister in the provincial government, and I was saying, the clearer you can be on what really is going to be important for you, that the clearer your whole ministry will be, and you'll deliver more. So I was always trying to tease that out of ministers in my connections. I loved working with ministers, you know. I respect them enormously. I respect politicians, you know. And I remember a minister saying at a briefing to an ADM who was kind of, I guess, maybe going overboard in terms of his advice. He kind of stopped and said, "Hey, have you ever run for anything?" And it was an interesting question, you know, because it's like you realize how protected public servants are, well, at least up till recently, how they are protected from that, you know, the limelight. And when I worked for the provincial government, we would often finish our briefings just before question period. So that's what I mean about a little more rough and tumble. The minister would just like walk out that door and there would be a scrum. I was the Deputy Minister of Environment in BC, and that at a time when there was just huge, you know, there was a huge battle over forestry. So you would sort of see, I respect ministers. I think that it's a key relationship. When it's working well, you can do anything. When it's not working well, it's really hard to kind of overcome that, I'd say, yeah. You know, I've always seen myself as a leader within a context. So I feel like I really believe in myself as a leader that in connecting with others, that's an important part of leadership. I perhaps kind of grew up in a time when there was a sort of rejection of the great man role, you know, kind of model of leadership, so it was more participatory. So leadership for me means being able to actually have the art of being able to get things done through other people. And that's why you need the connection, right? So that was a big emphasis of mine as a leader, is just how I'm connecting. You know, having started as a public service in local government, there was sort of an immediacy to that really was different. Like I felt when I worked for the city of Ottawa, you'd be amused at this because you live in Ottawa, I knew every intersection. I got to know the city so completely, so that because I was often on the firing line as well. You know, when you're an executive at the city, you have to respond on the, you know, and oftentimes with the camera rolling, right? And so that immediacy was really different, and the sense of, you know, making decisions that would affect people at the community level. And then as I went, I'll just tell you something funny, is when I first went to the provincial government, and first time I was waiting outside a cabinet, it all of a sudden dawned on me how easy this is. There's no media, no one knows even what we're bringing in. Like the paper, the secrecy, cabinet secrecy. It just all of a sudden, just like a light went on. I was like, well, this is a piece of cake, you know, a piece of cake in terms of not having to deal with all the dynamics, because there's so much more transparency at that time because everything that was on a council agenda, you know, had been distributed a few days ahead, so everyone knew what was going up and your work, you know, was so much more transparent. So my public service career, you know, I had a unique opportunity to go from the very immediate level to being really at the, you know, in the federal government, where there was so much work that we did at cabinet committees that never saw the light of day, right? I remember having to manage a huge crisis it was when the Chalk River nuclear reactor was shut down by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So it was like an absolute, like the biggest crisis I'd ever managed, you know, where we were doing like almost 24/7. And it's the first time that I've ever been exposed. Within about 24 hours, a committee of the whole of Parliament was convened. And that was the only time I sat in Parliament with Maurice Rosenberg. He was the Deputy of Health and I was Deputy of NRCan. We were sitting on the floor. And it was, wow, it was the highest wire act I've ever been involved in. We had too small a group to manage the size of the issue. And I should have recruited and brought more people in. One of my key subject matter ADMs at the time had a terrible response to that health issue. So it was just out of the. So at the time, and we should have, had a way, and I think it's very relevant given the kind of emergencies we're facing, to bring more resources in. Like that, we had this whole department, and I think we were running on too small a team, just given the, just the demands, One thing I tell them is, there's no more important work you can be doing and no more fulfilling work you could be doing. And the really important thing to kind of cultivate is your own curiosity. That there's so much to learn. There's from horizontally and also just from a depth perspective, that I would encourage them to learn as much as they can, and to value the contribution they're making. It can seem sometimes like fairly weak, I would say. Only that I remember speaking to young public servants who told me that they spent all their days writing briefing notes. So I said, okay, you think of it as writing briefing notes, but you should be thinking of it as you're providing advice to the minister. Like that you are part of the democratic process. And I also really don't believe you should be leaving people to writing briefing notes, for too long. They should get exposed, but also that you should follow your work, see where it goes, and try to cultivate your own sense of just the possibilities, of public policy. So I recommend to all young people that they should work within the public service. I had an extremely rewarding career, but I think a lot of it is because I was always curious, right? And so I guess the curiosity and then the respect for the institution. And that's never more important than right now, yeah. I really want to talk about collective leadership. This is something that I think is so important, which is that as a deputy minister, it's not who you are as a leader, it's how your team leads together. And I've found that some of the best investments I made as a deputy was in convening my executive team, and sometimes with the help of outside counsel, to try to understand how we work together, and to be to really aim to be exemplary together. Because I think that everyone is looking at the team. So if two ADMs are not talking to each other, their staff will never work together. And the kind of issues that we're facing right now are so complex that it really does require a collaborative approach. So I guess that's one of my more important learnings, was it doesn't matter how good a leader you are. If the people who are part of your team are not, kind of consistent in the way they're demonstrating leadership, that it really does take. And it started, at Environment Canada, where we created a charter for the executive team. But that was kind of a learning that I went on, and I've used a number of times since then, which is that how we lead it really is collective. That we're an organism, if you will, and it doesn't matter what one individual does. So I guess I would recommend that as something that deputies, invest their time in thinking about, yeah.